this computer. Yeah, so given that we've got a small group today, I think what I want to do primarily is to maybe point you to some resources, both thinking about how to put rubrics together, but also there are some sites that have, rubric banks or other, sets of rubrics that you can use as models. You're both, I want to get into Moodle and show you how you can set up rubrics in Moodle.
Okay. Oh, cool.
But also, I find I use more, what does Moodle call it? Scoring guides, grading guides, rather than full-blown rubrics. And so we'll talk about the difference between those and how they're set up. And then, if you've got specific assignments in mind, maybe we can spend some time, even though, we're doing this remotely, we're not in the room workshopping. Maybe we can think about, defining some of the elements of a rubric for a particular assignment that you have in mind.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's just share the whole desktop.
Oh, cool.
So you can see my Google Doc now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
So I think we touched on some of this in the pre-recording conversation, but I think it's useful to think about rubrics from your view as the instructor, but also the student view. So Dee, you mentioned that students sometimes ask for rubrics, right? And so what's the student interest in having a rubric?
I guess they often would like to understand the reasoning behind getting a certain score or a certain grade.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things from the student's perspective. One is, why did I get the grade I got? But also, rubrics can help students, even before they submit the work, understand what the work should be that they're working on, right? Mm-hmm. And from our perspective as instructors, I think there's a couple of things that we're probably interested in. One is, how can I make sure I'm consistent when I'm grading the 59th position on this assignment compared to what how I graded the first one? If you've got a large class, or how can I reduce my agonizing over what grading I'm giving? So let me just. There's a site that I want to point you to if you're not familiar with it. This Authentic Assessment Toolbox site. I just pulled up a couple of pages from it. Hopefully you're seeing the tab with that page in it.
I just
Are you still just seeing my Google Doc?
I can't. For some reason, I lost your Google Doc. Let me see. It happened when I tried to pull up my Word document where I'm taking notes, and I lost your.
Okay.
Okay, I see it now. Okay, Authentic Assessment Toolbox.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Ursula's joined us, so.
Hi.
We got
Hi.
Dennis and Deanna.
How are you?
So I guess the first question is, what constitutes a rubric? And you basically need to think of what are the criteria you're going to include in the rubric. And Janice, some of your concerns might be, how do I get the right balance between making it too complicated versus making it too simple?
Right.
Part of that is going to be defining, well, what are the criteria that I want to use the rubric to focus the assignment on? What are the different components? Mm-hmm. What are the dimensions of those? And how am I going to describe them, and how am I going to score them? Mm-hmm. So I mean, basically, when you're coming up with a rubric, you have to figure out what are the components of the activity or the assignment or the student work that you're looking at. I think that you want to figure out what's the relative importance of those different components. I've seen a lot of rubrics where there are like four components that have been identified, and then there's a poor, fair, good, excellent kind of scale.
Yeah, proficiency.
Right, and there's
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4 points, and those rubrics kind of lock you into having the same amount of weight given to the different criteria that are being assigned. So we want to talk about how to weight those different rubrics elements. So the criteria and levels of performance, this page talks about that. The idea of trying to use the rubric to make it clear to your students what's going on and to make it easier for your grading, it's going to really depend on how thoughtful you are about these descriptors that go into each of these cells. And so we want to talk about that, because you could have a rubric where you just, here are the criteria, and I'm going to grade you poor, good, or excellent. You get 1, 2, or 3 points for each of these 4 things, and you get a total of, ignore the 3 here. You get a total of, a dozen points, and you get 10 points out of 12, you get that grade. But this doesn't tell a student, well, what's a poor number of sources? Right. What's a good number of sources? What's an excellent number of sources?
Right.
So, defining those descriptors
right.
is very important for the rubric to be useful to your students and to you.
And lots of historical inaccuracies is kind of vague.
Yeah, yeah. So this is not necessarily.
It's a little vague.
One way, and we'll come back to this. We're talking about steps for setting up rubrics, but one way of approaching this is, well, what's your excellent and what's your poor? How would you define those? Those might be the easiest endpoints to figure out. And then, well, what's the intermediate cases, and how many of those intermediate cases? So historical accuracy, no apparent inaccuracies. You got a few. Well, that's my judgment call as an instructor. And your paper is riddled with historical inaccuracies. That,
you made it up. It's fiction. The organization piece, though, also could be more of the research methods. So, like, if you have an introduction, like, instead of just saying organization, put introduction, then put literature review, like, tease it out.
I guess the point I would make here is your rubric is probably not going to replace the assignment description.
Right.
It's going to augment or supplement your description for the assignment.
Yeah,
that's a good point. That's a good point to make.
And actually, I want us to go through in a couple of minutes to over an example of from my work. One thing I do want to point out, though, is some different different categories of rubrics. So this up here is kind of an analytical rubric, because you're analyzing, you're pulling the pieces apart, the different components, as opposed to a holistic rubric where you're not trying to pull apart all of these different components of the assignment and give feedback on them individually, but rather, this was an overall excellent. You included these numbers of sources. There were no apparent historical inaccuracies. All the relevant information included, and so forth. So in this example, you can see it's kind of this analytical rubric has just been collapsed down.
Right.
So what's the disadvantage of having a holistic rubric? How would you grade a paper that included 10 to 12 sources but had lots of historical inaccuracies?
Yeah, that's problematic because, you know, it's problematic. It
Or is
can't be a
that-
3 because if you've got all these historical inaccuracies, you've got to
Yeah.
have points for that.
Yeah, the only way that you could do it is instead of using 3, 2, 1 is to use it on a scale of 12, because then you could divide it up so that if you circled,
Yeah, but if you end up
do you know what I mean?
eventually
If you circle, oh,
if you end
you
up
have that too,
yeah.
right? You have the same thing, but if you circled like a dot in the other, a
Right.
bullet in the other section, at least you could give them 2 points for good research or
right.
3 points for this, 1 point for that.
Yeah.
Like you could.
So you've essentially
Yeah.
you're essentially taking the holistic rubric and teasing it apart.
Yeah.
I mean, there are when faculty think of rubrics, they more regularly think of these analytical rubrics.
Yeah.
But there
Yeah,
might be some times when you just want a simple overall.
right.
Here's the things I'm going to be looking at and present it to your students.
So for that one, for the holistic one, I've seen that in courses that I've taken, and they generally, actually they used it for almost everything, but they
Really?
use it mostly for a discussion board
Yeah.
where it was kind of not as
Yeah.
deep.
So this page that I pointed you to, it talks about when you might want to use an analytical rubric versus a holistic rubric. Talks about different levels for the criteria. These are all things you can think about when you're coming up with rubrics for your specific assignments. The other thing is some people make a distinction between kind of a general purpose rubric, which you might have a general purpose discussion forum rubric that you use for every discussion forum in your online course. It's just the same thing. I'm not going to reinvent the wheel every time there's a discussion forum. But for other things, you're going to have a task-specific discussion, a rubric, because so there's that. Also, that same site, there's another page you might want to take some time to look at, which is kind of walks you through some of the steps.
That's cool.
Okay, so you might find this site useful. Essentially, we skip down to the bottom lower. In general, I think these are a good set of steps to think about when you are designing your rubrics. First of all, what's the purpose? Do you want a real analytical rubric? You just want a general purpose discussion forum rubric? Assuming you are going to do an analytical rubric, then what are the important criteria?
Right.
How many levels are you going to have with each of those criteria? Now, do each of your criteria have to have the same number of levels? I've seen lots of rubrics where they're just a grid of 5 criteria and 4 levels, and each criterion has the same number of levels. You don't have to be locked into that. You might be developing an analytical rubric for a research paper where one of your criteria is the quality of the argument that's being developed. You might have 4 or 5 levels where you've actually described what really makes what constitutes a poorly developed argument, what constitutes an excellent argument, and what are the things in between. You might have a criterion that is, uses MLI style. Are you going to have 5 levels for that?
No.
Yes or no?
Whether you do or don't.
Yeah. So the different criteria don't even have to have the same number of levels. And when we go into Moodle to see how to implement this, we can talk about how to do that. And then in the case I'm just talking about, is the yes or no on do they use MLI style versus the 5-level criteria on the quality of their research argument, should those be given the same weight in grading the assignment? Probably not.
Mm.
So you want to have a way to provide more emphasis, more weight to some of the criteria than others. Now, if you look at these, at this analytical rubric that's just given as an example here, you can see, well, they've pulled out 4 criteria. They happen to have the same number of levels for each of the criteria. Again, as we've just talked about, you don't have to have that. Which of these criteria is more important from the perspective of the person who put this rubric together? That's what's going on here with this.
Accuracy.
Yeah, the historical.
Yeah, accuracy.
Yeah. So the way this rubric is set up is basically you get 1 point out of 3 for number of sources if you've got 1 to 4, 2 points if you've got 5 to 9, 3 points if you've got 10 to 12. You get 9 points if you have no inaccuracies in your paper. You get 6 points if you've got few inaccuracies. You've got 3 points if you've got no inaccuracies. So this weighting is the way that this rubric shows that this is, essentially 3 times as important as any of these other things.
Yeah, so if a student is not graded organization, but has the historical accuracies kind of down pat,
So you get
they
9.
could
I like
make it
that.
through the gate. Yeah.
You get
Yeah.
9 points here, 2
Yeah.
points here is 11, maybe 1 point here is 12, and 2 points here is 14. You get 14 out of
9, 10, 11,
18.
12. 12?
No, 18.
9? Oh, yeah.
9 and 9. Okay.
Right.
So 14 out of 18.
Not bad.
You can.
Yeah.
You can get an 80.
So that's one way of
Okay.
handling this if you were just going to
Yeah.
do it this way. And if you go through this, how to create, talks about what things we just talked about, different weights, different levels of, different criteria having different numbers of levels and so forth.
Oh, that's great. I like the example for the oral presentations because I do a lot of that as well. And
Yeah, I like that
Yeah.
too.
And that's one where you might, have the same general, this
Yeah.
would be a general holistic rubric.
Yeah.
Use it for every oral presentation.
yeah, good.
So I think it's worth taking a couple of minutes here to bring up a specific example from my courses. So we're talking about Janice. I've been doing the geology course for the last several years, and for the lab and field component, having a field notebook is an important component, right? So every time we go out, we did like 7, 8 field trips over the course of the semester. We're off campus, we're at these sites, and I have given my students, lots of, examples of here are ways to keep a field notebook. So I forget where I got this one from. It was some openly licensed, freely shared thing. So I put it up here. Talks about general suggestions, use a good quality notebook, all good advice for my students to keep in mind when they are taking their field notes. Talks about the different components, talks about making sketches, gives some actual example sketches of the, kind of observations they should be
Yeah.
recording out in the field. So that's one. And then I also gave them another one. So, I mean, they can't say that they don't have a lot of advice on how to,
Yeah.
to
Their
take.
choices. Yeah.
Yeah.
Why would I be interested in developing a rubric for this? And why would my students be interested in having that rubric?
They'll know how you're going to judge them.
They'll know how I'm going to
Yeah.
judge them. Because
Or
there's a
could
lot
do
of stuff
their,
here.
yeah,
Right?
they could do their field notes according to the rubric. Like, oh,
Yeah.
this, so
Yeah.
I'm going to make sure
Yeah.
I have pictures,
Right.
descriptions.
And the Albion Field Notebook actually does include the rubric that they use.
Oh, wow. Wow, look at that.
Now, this rubric, is it analytical or holistic?
Mm.
Holistic.
This looks like holistic. Well, wait a minute. There's
Yeah.
yeah, it's holistic. Yeah.
Because you could break it down further and make the other, you could
You-
take it and make it the second part of the criteria.
You could break it
Yeah.
down and make it more analytical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I like the comment column. I never thought to do that.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
So here's what I came up with for the rubric I used in my class.
Hmm.
So what are the criteria that I used?
Mhm.
Well, when we go out to a site, have they recorded the basic site information? Did they get the latitude, longitude, the date and the time, the weather, and all the other basic site information that was discussed in these documents about how to do a notebook? I had separate criteria for observations and interpretations, because it's very important for point that we're getting across is when you go out in the field, you're going to be making observations. You're going to be interpreting those observations, but you want to keep those distinct. You want to know,
Right.
you want to clearly record, here's what I saw.
Mhm.
Here's the sketch. Here's what I measured. Here's the size of this outcrop. Here's, whatever. The interpretation, this was a metamorphic structure that's been folded such and such a way. That's the interpretation. So I had separate criteria, separate components, criteria for observations and interpretation, and then overall, how useful would the field notes that student took on a site be to if they handed their field notebook to someone who hadn't been to the site?
Yeah. Could they understand?
Could they
it?
understand
Yeah.
it? They take that field notebook out to the site and
Right.
useful. So I then said, well, I'm going to have basic does not meet, approaches, meets, exceeds kind of
Yeah.
standard. But I did not weight these all the same. Basic site information, getting that recorded was not as important as their observations.
It's an easier category,
Yeah.
right? It's not as difficult.
Yeah, so 100% on that gave them 10 points. 100% on their observations gave them 50 points.
Yeah.
100% on the criteria, 30 points, and overall 10 points. So basically, the interpretations are 3 times the weight of either the overall or the basic site information, and the observations are 5 times the weight. So again, it's if you're thinking analytical and not just a kind of a general
Right.
holistic rubric, what are the criteria? What are the levels? How many levels do you want? And how are you going to weight those levels? If you think about those 4 things when you're thinking about your analytical rubrics, then that will be a good set of things to work through.
Well, I'm not a student of geology, obviously, but if I had this rubric and I had to do the field notes, I totally would know what you were looking for. I mean,
Yeah.
I better
it's
have some
crisp
good
and
observation.
clear. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Very
crisp.
clear. Very clear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like it.
So, yeah, so again, analytic versus holistic, general versus task specific.
Mm.
If it's analytic, go through those steps. What are your criteria? What are your levels? What are your descriptions? Again, those descriptions are important for the students to be able to know and be able to use a rubric. And I mentioned this before, but hint, start at the bottom, the unacceptable level and the mastery level. Here's what mastery looks like. Here's what unacceptable looks like. Well, then what does fair look like? What does good look like?
I always find the middle two harder.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of like, what's mediocre?
Yeah. So, and again, you might have 3 levels, you might have 5, depends on what criterion you're developing, and what makes sense for that.
Yeah.
I've got a bunch of rubric sites that I want to point to, but I think I'll take a few minutes to pop into Moodle to show how you would actually do this in Moodle. Where's my Moodle tab? There we go. Okay, so in our current version of Moodle, you can apply rubrics.
Why are you saying current? Are we moving on to something else?
Yeah, we're going to be upgrading to a newer version of Moodle by the fall.
Oh.
And there'll be announcements about that. I can actually pop that up if we've got time. But in the current version of Moodle, you can apply rubrics to the Moodle assignments. You can also apply rubrics to the Turnitin activities. If you use Turnitin,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, turn it in. Yeah.
they've got their own rubric builder. That's
Oh, they
different.
do? I didn't know.
Can you show us that as well?
Yes, I can probably do that. I don't usually use the rubrics.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, we can take a look at it. I like to have these workshops driven by what participants are interested in. But let's look at it in the default, in the plain vanilla Moodle assignment first.
Okay.
So I'm just going to add a Moodle assignment.
Okay.
And if you use Moodle assignments, you know the description, the setting the date and time, and so forth. If you go under grade, the default is to grade the assignment on a point value.
Okay.
In 100 points. You can change that.
Mm-hmm.
But the default is also simple direct grading. And what this does is, if it's a 100-point assignment, I just look at the submission for each student and give him or her a point value out of 100.
Mm-hmm.
But there are 2 other options. There's a grading guide and there's a rubric.
Okay.
We're going to look at rubrics first, but I do want to look at grading guides because I actually find grading guide more easier to use than the rubric.
Okay.
So if I say, okay, I'm going to set up this assignment and I'm going to use a rubric to grade it, I'll click Save and Display. And Moodle will tell me, okay, you said you're going to grade this as a rubric. You haven't given me a rubric yet. So for now, you're stuck with a simple 100-point scale. You can reuse rubrics and treat a previous rubric as a template for putting a rubric on this one, but we'll do one from scratch. So I'll call it field notebook example. So you can provide a description here, but I won't bother. It's not required. But again, if we're going to build an analytical rubric, what are the components?
The criteria,
Criteria,
the levels.
the levels for each
Levels,
criteria,
yeah. And points.
the
some kind of
points,
grading system.
and the description.
Yeah.
Right.
So you said rubrics, so Moodle is automatically going to start you off with at least one criterion. And if you're going to do a holistic rubric, you can just stick with one.
Mm.
But if we go back to my field notebook here,
Right.
I'm going to take this basic site information, and I'm going to name my first criterion basic site information.
Mm-hmm.
And then in describing the levels, I could just say poor here,
Yeah.
but instead I'm actually going to put in what the actual descriptor is.
Mm.
It's going to be more useful to the students
Sure.
Right.
than just poor. And approaches.
See, because what I didn't realize this was on there. So what I was doing is having a separate rubric that I attached. But since this
Yeah.
this is going to be very helpful.
Yeah. Now I've run out of levels.
Oh, you can add a level though. Yeah.
A level.
Oh, good.
And then does it automatically add the points or, yeah?
Moodle gives you complete control. So
Okay, that's great.
I said on this that I was going to do 9 to 10 points, and that will come into account when we're talking about the grading guide.
Mm-hmm.
But for the rubric, Moodle's going to ask you for this grading, for this level of the criterion, what are the points?
Mm.
So I'm going to just put 10 here,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to put 8 here rather than 7 through 9.
Yeah.
Right.
Moodle's not going to let you put 7 through 9
No,
Okay.
here. And I'm going to put 6 here.
but you know that it's 7.
Well, no,
Oh,
it is now 8.
Actually, you
It
put
You
is
put 8, actually. You put 8, yeah.
And
Only that.
for
You're
this-
doing the grading, does that mean that you can only assign either 6 or 8 or 10, for example, instead of 7?
So one of my questions that I didn't ask is
Oh,
what kind of limitations you see with a rubric? Well, if you have a formally defined rubric and you were scoring by that rubric, then it does take away some of your shades of gray.
mm.
That could be a limitation. It could also be a benefit.
No, it could benefit the student more than.
Yeah. So I'm going to put in a 3 here.
Mm.
So there's my first criteria.
Mm.
And you can say, well, obviously I just need to go and add the other criteria. And Moodle will not require you to have the same number of criteria levels for each criterion. By default, when you have defined one with 4 levels and added another one, you see it automatically put in 4. But if I didn't need this level, I could delete one or I could add a level. So one criterion could have 5 or 6 levels.
Oh.
Another one could have 2 or 3. I used add or subtract levels for the criteria as needed. Given that I do have a kind of a regular grid here, it works out well. And again, I'm going to put 50, 40. Although I could say maybe I want this to be 35, I want this to be 25, this to be 15. And I would add, the third criterion and the fourth criterion.
Mm-hmm.
I guess we don't need to actually
Are you, and would this total to 100 points? Is it?
I've got it set up to, well, maybe I should just to make it clear. So yeah, in my case, it totals to 100 points.
Okay.
But it
And
doesn't have to. It
doesn't
depends
have
on
to.
your-
Doesn't have to though.
Right.
Because that's a great thing about it. The Moodle will do the math for you. If,
Moodle will do the math for me. So, you know, if you had the number of criteria and the levels and these, it'll add up the point value for the highest level for each of the criteria that you have in your rubric.
Mhm.
And that will be the total possible points.
Okay.
And so I'm going to put this 30 and 25 and 20 and 12. And then this last one is going to just be overall utility. And then when you actually do the grading, we'll see that in a minute. You will just, for a particular student, click on the level for each of the criteria that makes sense, best represents that student's work. And as we talked about, Moodle will add things up for you and divide by the total possible points. So again, we want this to be 10 and 8, 6, and 3. So I've taken the rubric that I developed and I've replicated it here in Moodle and attached it to this assignment.
That's cool.
Calculate the grade based on the rubric having a minimum score of 0. So yes, I want, even though I don't have any zeros here, it's impossible for me with this rubric to actually give a student a 0.
Right.
They
But,
get something. Yeah.
But I want the rubric to be, a score to be graded on a 0 to 100 point scale. Okay, so that's the default. Allow users to preview the rubric. Do you want the students to be able to see this before?
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. Some faculty say, actually, no, I don't want to share my rubric. I want to have my rubric, but I don't want to share it with my students because students will, it's kind of weird, students will be able to cheat and know what they need to.
It's not really.
It's not cheating. It's
It's not
setting
cheating.
the expectations for the assignment.
Any expectations.
Yeah.
But you do have the option of not showing the students the rubric. The default, Moodle's default is, yeah, you've got this rubric, show it to the students.
I mean, when you go to an event and it says it's black tie, they're telling you ahead of time it's black tie.
Exactly. It's also default that the rubric description is displayed to you when you're evaluating the students. That makes sense. It's displayed to those who are graded. Students get to see the point values for each of the levels, or you see the point values for the levels as you're clicking. The students see, oh, I got a notes lag detail, but would be useful. I got 8 points. That's the default. Allow the grader to add text remarks for each criterion is also the default. Okay? And so I'm going to save that rubric, make it ready. And now none of my students have submitted, but I do want to go in and show you how you would grade this. So if you go in and view all the submissions, you would see, oh, sample student 5 has submitted. I'll go into grade. I will see what sample student 5 submitted, but let me expand this part out a bit. Based on that, site information was weak, so I select that. The notes are legible and moderately organized, I select that.
Oh, wow.
comments here, and very thoughtful, nice interpretations.
Hmm.
You know, it would be more useful if you did to others, if you did blah, 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 blah. So you can provide comments for this student's work on every criterion, and also overall comments. And students, when they see their grade, they'll see you were graded on, they were graded on this rubric, they got what levels for each criterion, the points that they got, and the comments both on the criteria and overall. And so this student would get 6, 41, 71, 77 out of 100.
And does it add that up for
We
you?
will put a 77 in the grade book.
Oh, wow, cool.
So for the assignments that don't have that PDF preview, can you still use the rubric? Like,
It's the
okay.
same grading interface whether you've got a PDF preview or not.
Okay.
And then I'll save those changes. And if I went into the grade book, now the student would actually have to go into the assignment to see the detailed, you know, rubric
Right.
scores. They would get, what the student would get in the grade book would be a grade of 77. And you see, there's the 77 up there.
Wow, that's cool.
And the grade book would also be able to display the overall feedback comments. But the student would have to go back into the assignment to view the
Rubric.
grading of their assignment to see the rubric.
But when we do our syllabus, we can actually tell them that, right?
Yep, yep.
And then when the assignment is in Moodle, like just that it's there, does it say there's a rubric? Like, does it? No,
Well,
not really.
not to me because I'm not a student.
Oh, right.
So, and actually I've got my whole sandbox.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I'll check.
So yeah, if you, I should have had another student logged in a different browser. I should have had sample student 5 logged in a different browser. We'd be
No,
able to take a
I
look.
understand, but I can check.
Yeah. Let me show you the grading guide approach, which is kind of like rubric light.
Sorry, Keith, I have to run to an event for the sophomore and freshman. I'll check the recording if that's okay.
Will do.
Sorry about that.
Good seeing you, Dee.
Good seeing you as well. Good seeing you, Ursula.
Yeah,
I'll
good
talk to you later.
Bye.
So again, it's same thing here. Start grading guide. Save the assignment. You're going to get the same message. You need to define a grading guide. It won't go through the whole thing here, but it's very similar to setting up the rubric, except you don't have to explicitly define all the levels and assign a point value to them. So
Okay.
here, if we go back to basic site information, that would be the criterion name, and the description would be, I would probably have a more detailed description than just this. But, and there's no reason not to show the same description to the graders. And now you just do a maximum score.
Oh, okay.
Which, and then you would add the observations criterion, you would add the interpretation criterion, with a maximum score of 50 for observation, maximum score of 30 for interpretation, a maximum score of 10 for overall utility. And then when you go to the grading, it's kind of in between. It's not, you're not just giving a number between 0 and 100. You're giving a number between 0 and 10 for their basic site information. And if I give a student a 7.5, they can go back here to the rubric that I would still give them this rubric,
Oh, okay.
but not build it into the Moodle assignment. And if I give a student a 7.5, that means that their site information was acceptable, but there were things that were incomplete about it. If I gave a student an 8.5, it would mean it was acceptable but not complete, but a little bit better than the acceptable but not complete that I gave a 7.5 to.
So like if you wanted to have a preliminary, like send in your field notes so many times during the semester, and then at the end, then you have the real big rubric, the larger rubric. You could go that route.
I mean, you could,
like,
but I like the flexibility that the grading guide gives me. So I do the grade. I say, here's the rubric for all of these field trips. Same rubric for every field trip. I'll grade it in Moodle using the grading guide tool, but you should interpret it in terms of this rubric.
I gotcha.
Because again, if we go back to that rubric example, I only have the ability to give a student a 50 or a 35 on their observations.
Oh.
Because,
Oh, here you could give anywhere between 0 to 10.
yeah,
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's why. I was trying to figure out why you prefer this.
yeah.
Okay, that's what it is.
Flexible, yeah.
Gives me the same focus on the criteria, the levels,
Yeah,
the fact that observations is 5 times as important as basic site information, but it gives me more latitude,
right,
anywhere between 0 and 50 for the observations.
right. I see what you're saying. Okay. Yeah, that's much better because you could be more specific.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now,
More
the
nuanced.
nice thing about the rubric is you go in and you just click, 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 and you're done, and that's the grade. And
Right.
you know, your observations weren't good enough to get a 50, so you got a 35, and Google adds it up. And you, as a faculty member, you don't have to agonize.
Mm-hmm.
Just click, 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 and the grade is there.
Mm.
With a grading guide, there's much more latitude for you to agonize.
Oh,
Okay, what is
no.
acceptable? Do I give it a 35? Do I give it a 37? Do I give it a 42?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Does it add it up the way the rubric featured it? No.
Yeah, so each of the criteria would have their total scores, and you know, 10 and 50 and 30 and 10 in the case of my field guide rubric. And you know, if a student got an 8 and 35 and 29, because they really were almost perfect on their interpretations, and a 10 out of 10 on their overall utility, that would be added up, and it would be some number that I didn't keep track of. That's, you know.
But you would have to add it up.
No.
Oh no, the grade book.
Moodle will add it up just like we add up the scores for.
Just like it did with the rubric. Okay.
Just like with the rubric.
Okay.
You basically give 4 scores, 0 out of 10.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got the 4 criteria like we're talking about, 0 out of 10, 0 out of 50, 0 out of 30, 0 out of 10, and Moodle will add those up and put the total in the grade book for the student.
So let's say the student got a, I don't know, 77, and you were like, well, you know, maybe the student, you know, really should be an 80. Does Moodle give the option to override?
You could always go into the grade book
and change it.
The assignment has put a 77 in the grade book.
But I can change
you
it.
can give it an 80, and it will show up as this score. It will show up in the grade book as this score has been overwritten.
Okay.
Yeah, but can you go in the grading guide and change one of the grades?
You could, if you using the grading guide, you've got the
Yeah, you could,
latitude
I
to put
guess,
in
yeah.
whatever you
Yeah.
want. So
I mean, after you've like, let's say you've graded it and you've submitted it.
you
and
can go back and regrade it. Yeah.
Oh, that's
You
good.
you can.
Yeah.
Go back? Okay. That's what I was like. Maybe you had second thoughts and thought.
Yeah, I mean, you can go back and regrade the rubric graded assignment as well.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm going to cancel here.
Mm-hmm.
If I went back into this rubric example, into the view all submissions and grade sample student, if I want to decide, oops, wrong way. that no, actually, instead of this one, it's this one.
Mm-hmm.
Save those changes,
Yeah.
then we'll
Up it.
upgrade it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Like
so-
70 Oh, they almost have an 80. All right. That's
Okay.
cool.
So those are grading guide and rubric on Moodle assignments.
Mhm.
If we go into Turnitin,
Is there any difference between Turnitin 1 and Turnitin 2?
Turnitin 2 is what you need to be using now.
Oh, okay.
The only reason we've
Turnitin.
got Turnitin 1 displayed is so that faculty can, if we don't have it showing, then they can't go back to their old courses and view their old Turnitin
Oh.
assignments.
Okay.
So I won't go through all the Turnitin settings. But if we go, yeah,
Oh, wow. Look
right
at
here
that.
is launching the rubric manager.
Oh.
Oh, pretty cool. I never knew that existed.
And again, like I don't use rubrics in Turnitin, so I'm just going to see what it pulls up. And not sure why it's taking so long to talk to the folks that Turnitin.
It sometimes does that though.
Sometimes does that. I mean, it's one of the things you deal with when you put a third-party
Yeah.
service provider into the LMS.
This will make my life easier because I was giving them their final paper, their capstone back
Mm.
with a grade for their whole semester attached to another, to the email had 3 attachments. So they had the capstone, the grade, and the rubric. So this
Wow.
will make my life way easier.
Yeah, it's a streamline.
Okay. So again, I haven't used the rubric manager and Turnitin.
But that's a pretty good example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, it would be a matter of defining the criteria, the levels, how you're going to score them. I don't know that, I haven't used it enough to know whether you're required to have the same level,
Yeah, that's
the same
okay.
number of levels,
Yeah.
things like that.
Right.
Okay, so let me back out of this.
It's a good option.
Yeah.
When we bring up Moodle 3.8 in the fall, what we talked about with rubrics and grading guides on the assignment, you'll also be able to apply those to discussion forums.
Oh, cool.
Oh, nice.
Nice. Yeah.
And we actually do have a Moodle 3.8 sandbox set up.
Hmm.
So if you go to add a discussion forum activity, there are some other nice new features with discussion forums that we'll be rolling out, but there is this whole forum grading opportunity.
Mm.
And in the case of discussion forums, the discussion forums by default are not graded, but if you turn on points,
Mm-hmm.
then you've got the same
Okay.
grading guide or rubric.
Okay.
Okay.
Cool.
So just, I know we're kind of running up to the hour here, but I do want to point out some different resources.
Okay.
Do we have the ability to have this? Because on ours,
Yeah.
we can't click, obviously.
Right, but you see this little short URL?
Oh, good. Okay,
It'll
good.
take you right into the
Thanks.
So AAC&U has been doing a lot of work on general education and liberal education, liberal arts education, their whole LEAP, liberal education, I forget what the LEAP program is. Part of that is to develop this these value rubrics.
Hmm.
The value program itself is valid assessment of learning in undergraduate education. As said, it's part of the LEAP initiative, Liberal Education and America's Promise from AAC&U. But they have developed a whole range of rubrics for important skills and knowledge areas for general education.
Okay.
Critical thinking, oral communication, quantitative literacy, intercultural competency. If you go to the AAU CNU site, you can download those. You just pull up to show you what.
Oh, I think I've used these actually.
Yeah. So for each of the rubric areas, like civic engagement, there's a two-pager basically. One is
Well,
kind of a definition of what their definition of civic engagement is, framing language, some definitions, and then they have set up basically, again, are these holistic or analytic rubrics? Analytic rubric.
Yeah.
So they've pulled out, well, what are the different dimensions or criteria for civic engagement? And what does a capstone performance in that look like? What does kind of getting started perform? They don't say does not meet.
Right.
I like that better.
Yeah,
So
it's
this is
very
basically
positive.
does not meet,
I like
approaches,
milestones. That's
meets,
kinda cool.
and exceeds.
Exceeds, right.
But I mean, they are also looking at these in a developmental kind of format. So, for a freshman, this level might be actually appropriate, but we hope that by the time they get to be a senior, they get to be more toward
True.
capstone.
Right,
So
right.
one thing we haven't talked a lot about in terms of general education on campus is, approaching it from this kind of developmental perspective, where you don't just take college writing and get your written communication checked off, but how do we develop, appropriate levels? But anyway, it's a whole separate.
Yeah.
Critical thinking, creative thinking, the same kind of thing. What's the definition? What's the framing language? Do they need to define anything? And then, again, another analytical rubric. What are the criteria and the levels? So it's worth checking out that that CNU site. Next several are just some pages that are a combination of some of the general things we talked about. But I picked these from different teaching and learning centers, but I picked these out because they've got some example rubrics here. So if you are doing oral communication and you want a couple of different rubrics that other people have developed to look at for models, you can,
Always nice to have a model.
always nice to have models. Why reinvent the wheel?
Why do it?
Hawaii at Manoa has a really nice rubric bank. So, and part of this is tied into the AAC&U value project. So they're also looking at the value rubrics, but they've got other examples beyond the rubric, beyond the value project.
That's really cool.
It's a lot of choices, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we'll talk about choices in a minute here. I liked this site because it had some different examples. It's also got some of the some of the background material you might want to look at. We've got some of these texts in our library collection here. different articles and resources. That's useful. Santa Clara, again, that was just another rubric bank. Again, they're also part of the LEAP initiative from AAC&U, so they're tying into the LEAP, the value rubrics, but also have examples. Scientific inquiry, that be nice when I maybe go back and teach my Mars exploration course again. SUNY has a few rubrics for some of the SUNY learning outcomes. Please point to these last two resources if you want a place to go to look for examples. These are both places where you can go look for examples. So oral communication. Well, how many oral communication rubrics do you want to look through? Or
More than one. That's very cool.
Quite a lot, yeah.
So there actually are some rubrics at the site here tagged geology.
Oh my God, it's amazing.
So
But at least you're not, like you said, you're not reinventing the wheel. You can add what you want, delete what you want, put your own, spin on it, but at least you have something.
Yeah, that's great.
Rubistar is kind of the same.
And then when you make it up, you put it on Teacher Pay Teachers and they pay you. People will buy your rubrics.
I didn't have to log in before. Where's the general search? Search for a rubric. So again,
Great. Yeah.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
And iRubric is and both of these places are places where you can register an account so you can contribute rubrics as well as search for them. So yeah, I mean we're all faculty, we're all in this together. Why not make it easy for all of us to just share some of the resources that we put together?
Yeah.
So I mean, there's some nice tools for using rubrics in Moodle, for the assignments and the Turnitin activities. Some good resources for you to draw on when you're thinking about rubrics for your own assignments. Again, think of the rubric not as a replacement for the assignment, but you've got your assignment. You want some structured framework within which to grade the assignment. Think about your assignment. If you are going to do an analytical rubric where you're pulling apart the criteria, well, what are those criteria that are important? And you probably don't want 25 criteria.
Right.
If you have one criterion, well, you've got a holistic rubric. If you've got 4 or 5 or 3 or 6, these indicate to the student, here are the important parts of the assignment, not parts of the assignment, here are the important aspects of the assignment that you should have in mind as you're working on it. And here are the different levels of performance that you could, do all the way from mastery down to unacceptable. And here, these criteria have higher weights than others because they're more important aspects of the assignment. Provides a framework for the students so that they are more likely to give you assignments that reflect what you want from your students. And whether you use the rubric tool or the grading guide, in either case, you've got that rubric framework so that you've got more consistency in how you're scoring students, and hopefully it makes it quicker for you to grade the students.
Yeah.
So I don't remember if I asked this or if I was just thinking it, so I'll ask it again. So the student can look at the rubric by clicking on before the grade? Like, if you don't, like, how do they see the rubric ahead of time? Is it within the assignment? Okay.
So I actually have the ability to become sample student 5. Since I'm system administrator. And so now if I go in and look at this rubric example, I see, well, here's the grading rubric.
Mm.
And here's how I was scored.
But do they see that rubric when they first go into, like, before they complete the assignment?
Yeah. So everything above the submission part,
Okay.
they see before they submit.
Oh,
Okay.
good.
So
Okay.
the student would have seen this
Okay.
rubric before they click add submission.
Mhm.
Okay.
After you
Yeah.
have graded it, they will see,
Yeah.
oh, well,
Okay.
I guess I could have done a little bit better on jotting down what the site information was.
So we just have to point it out to them, because in my other college, it's the same way. So it's above their, like, here's where you could submit
Well,
it and there's the grade. So, but I guess I could take a screenshot and put it in.
Hmm.
This from here to here is what they will see when they go in to submit the assignment. There's no way they can avoid seeing the rubric.
Yeah, but I would have to, well, students, I would have to tell them ahead of time before you submit, as you're working on the assignment,
Yes.
you can see
Right.
the rubric and here's where it is.
Now,
Or I could take a screenshot and put it
there's
ahead,
no reason why I couldn't.
you know what I'm saying is
Yeah.
then,
But you don't need to do a screenshot, because once they go into the assignment, just tell them to go
Well,
click into.
I know, but
It's creating more work for you to do a
no, I
screenshot.
know, yeah, I am.
but if you've got, like, I had this PDF for the rubric.
Yeah.
I actually gave them a hard copy of it.
Oh, good.
Oh,
I
Okay,
put
yeah.
the PDF up in the course,
Okay,
and then every assignment they would see that
yeah,
Oh, okay.
framework presented to them again.
yeah. Because in my other college, they did not go into we use Blackboard.
Oh,
So they were like, she never gave us the rubrics ahead of time, but all the rubrics
Oh.
were there. So then I realized that nobody had ever pointed out to them,
wow.
there's where the rubric was.
Yeah.
Right.
So if we go back to my course, well, actually, I have to.
Hello.
Hey,
Hi.
good.
Hi.
Oh, yeah, we're about ready to switch over to the next webinar. So let me stop sharing here. Let me